Please welcome to the stage, Jordan Topoleski, Chief Operating Officer of Cursor, Vab Goel, Founding Partner of NTT VC, and Chris Shaw, Chief Marketing Officer of NTT Research.
How's everyone doing? Good. Jordan, first of all, thank you for the friendship, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I know how busy you are. Before we get started, I want to share a few stats about Cursor. And it truly is one of the most amazing applied AI companies out there. If anybody does not know, Cursor is the one who invented AI for software development. Cursor is only a 3-year-old company and have already reached $2 billion annual revenue run rate. I will say basically it's probably the fastest company to reach $2 billion in ever. So about 70% of Fortune 500 companies are using Cursor. Jordan, I will ask you to ask your team to check. There are a lot of people who have registered as a Gmail or Yahoo. If you reverse it, I think they just haven't told their companies yet they're using. And there are 2 million plus software developers on weekly basis are using Cursor. Can you explain, right? There are so many use cases that have been talked about AI. And one thing always comes into is the play is like, hey, there's a lot of POCs, but making it production is really hard. But at least Cursor have changed that for software development. It doesn't get any better than any production example. You guys really pioneered this field. Can you give us a little bit of insight, how you did it and what you're doing?
Absolutely. First off, thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. What a great show. As Fab mentioned, my name's Jordan, and I have a fun job. I get to spend my day with CIOs and CTOs all around the world who are thinking about this crazy moment we're in right now. I mean, my goodness. As AI has started to impact all the work that's done across the world, software development has been this particular area that has a really big impact. And I get to work with a lot of these companies who are thinking about the way it's going to change the shape of their organization and the shape of R&D across their whole organization. Cursor started about 3.5 years ago with this idea that AI would have an impact in a lot of areas, but that coding in specific was this area that had a lot of potential. And it had a lot of potential for many reasons. There's a lot of data out there. It's deterministic. When you run the code, it either works or it doesn't work. For all these underpinnings where it felt like there was a really big opportunity to go think about how it would be done. When we went into the market, one of the very first theses we had was that in this market, you were going to build a tool for the job, but ultimately what was going to happen is the job was going to change for the tool. I think it frankly happened even quicker than we expected it to happen. But this approach was saying, in the way this work has been done in the past, the challenge is both going to be building the technology to be excellent, but also bringing people along for the way that their job was going to change. So we went out and what we did was, instead of just building this on top of the code editors people had used in the past as a plugin or an extension, which had historically been the ideas, we said instead, how do you build a platform that's re-architecting this for the future? We went out working with a lot of different design partners out there in the market, very clearly focused on working with enterprise organizations, where it wasn't just about spinning up net new greenfield projects and landing pages and things like that. It was about working inside of existing really large code bases and enterprise-grade applications, the security requirements, all these different pieces, to get to a place where we could actually ship that code into production. Now, there's kind of an evolution that we saw in our product over time, where at the beginning, we were really focused on saying, how do you take work a developer already does and make it a bit quicker? So the first kind of phase, or the first wave that you saw in AI coding that we started was autocomplete. Kind of think of it like your Gmail autocomplete, but done a little architecturally differently. we would spend time looking at all of the work you were doing the past 10 or 15 minutes and had an AI model of our own, actually, that would predict what your next edit would be. Called it Cursor Tab. You could click Tab, and it would keep completing the work that you're actually doing. This, in a lot of ways, was this really exciting moment. It took folks from writing all of the manual code themselves to being able to accelerate that. You saw 10% or 15% productivity gains. As it happened into the late parts of 2024, coming into 2025, you saw this completely new explosion as we entered into Wave 2. Wave 2 was the introduction of the agent, which I know is a hot word these days. With the agent, it was this idea that you almost had this colleague that you could pair program with. You could actually write what you wanted with, click enter, and what we would do is spider all through your code base, go to an LLM model, generate the code that you're asking for, come back and actually apply it inside of your code base. And with this, we saw a much bigger explosion. It wasn't just 10% or 15% productivity gains. We saw something like 35 to 40% plus of the code getting pushed to production actually being written by AI along the way. And now today we sit at this really interesting moment where we're starting to enter into this third wave. And what we're seeing in this third wave is as these agents get better at running longer tasks, you actually have the opportunity to run multiple of them in parallel. And as that starts to happen, it actually rethinks the whole equation, where you're not just bound by the individual time, you're bound by the ability to go a higher level as an individual contributor. You're actually focused almost more like a manager, where you're orchestrating several of these agents in the way that you're actually writing software. With that, we've just seen this huge explosion in how people have used these tools. We went from a place where 12 months ago, the average enterprise customer we worked with had about 6% of the code that they pushed into production that was originated by Cursor. So today, this number is over 60% in 12 months. Just think about that for a second. That means we're dramatically shifting the way the last 25 or 30 years of software development have been done. And what we're doing is going in and working with these companies and saying, yes, how does our technology as this platform for people to accelerate the way they're writing code obviously help individual developers, but also how does it help CIOs and CTOs think about what this change is going to make inside of their organization? What is the change management that's needed? What are the processes you need to put in place? What is the talent footprint you need in a world where the skill set might in fact be a little bit different than in the past? And so much of a successful rollout in what we're seeing is not just about the tool. It's about coupling the tool with the right organizational strategy to innovate in R&D, which I'm excited to talk about a bunch today with you both.
Thank you for being here. And again, thanks everybody for being here as well. We've got quite a turnout. You answered some of the question I'm going to ask, so I'm going to just a little twist on it. You talked about the last 12 months and how you're implementing it with, in the enterprise and how they're seeing it. Tell me about what's going on in Cursor. How are your engineers doing it? And especially, what's the last 3 months has been incredibly consequential. 12 months is one thing, but the last quarter, incredible. So what's happening with your engineers? Are you using Cursor to write your own code?
Yeah, we're seeing some really interesting things in how even the structure of the organization starts to change. A few different themes we can talk about. The first thing we're seeing is writing code is no longer becoming the bottleneck. So the thing to think about when you're thinking about code generation is it's actually just one part of the process. Actually, what we're working within is the larger software development lifecycle: plan, design, write, review, test, deploy. And for so long, you've seen this bell curve in a way type graph, where developers would spend comparably little time at the beginning, spend a lot of their time writing the code, and comparably less time at the end. The first big trend that we've seen is actually an inversion of that curve. What you're seeing is AI is at a place where oftentimes it can write 60, 70, 80% of the code, which means what starts to become the bottleneck are other parts of the organization, other parts of the software development lifecycle. The planning and the design process are thought about in a different way. The test and review process needs to be thought about in a different way. And what we're finding is instead of having these siloed teams, more of the waterfall methodologies that people have thought in the past, and even some of the agile methodologies, you need to rethink what this software factory of the future is actually going to look like. Instead, what we'll oftentimes see is when we're starting a new feature, it's not just a PM works on it and thinks about scoping it out. Lift and shift, you go over to a designer who's designing it and thinking through what it'll look like. Lift and shift and move it over to an engineer. It's actually all these people will hop on a call together and share their screen and build a prototype in 20 minutes live on the call. The designer understands the technical requirements they're working within. the PM actually understands more of the end-to-end nature of how this product's actually going to be implemented. So the first thing is you're seeing more fuzziness in that software development lifecycle, where it's not as concrete different steps that you're seeing all along the way. That's the first big trend that we're seeing. The second big trend that we're seeing is people are focusing on the what instead of the how. What I mean by that is so much of the job of being an engineer and a technical person in the past has been how am I going to implement this? How is the architecture going to look? Things like this. Instead, we find people are pushed earlier in the process to focus on these higher level pieces. What am I going to do? What is the right business context that I want to pull into this? A higher level of getting that thinking through up front to then cascade it downstream by providing the right context in different pieces along the way. We watched internally, it was pretty crazy. When we had just this single agent world that kind of talked about in that phase 2, we watched internally something like 70 to 75% of our code actually be originated by AI. In the last quarter specifically, as you mentioned, is we've introduced what we call cloud agents, this idea that you can run multiple agents at the same time in parallel in a cloud environment. We watched our code that goes into production written by AI go to 97.3%. 97.3%. Crazy to think about. Again, like literally a year ago, this was sub 10%. What we're seeing as that happens is just a total rethinking again of what that whole software development lifecycle is going to look like. It creates these all bottlenecks. We joke sometimes at Cursor that ultimately Cursor is an internal tools company, and that we're building Cursor to build Cursor even better than we have in the past.
So you're eating your own dog food.
Exactly, totally dog fooding the product in an extreme way. And the really fun and fascinating thing is this is almost a boundless problem, where as you write more and more of the code, you introduce these next bottlenecks. I was with the CIO of a very large insurance company a couple weeks ago, and he was telling me, he said, hey, we rolled out Cursor, and prior to that, we were shipping something like 150,000 lines of code per week across our whole organization. We're at about 800,000 lines of code per week. And all the other things are starting to break. Code review is breaking. Our CI/CD pipelines and how we merge that into production is breaking. All these upstream things that start to happen. And I think this interesting moment we're in, and the question leaders need to ask for their organization is, one, how do we adopt this new world, and what is this going to mean for the way we structure our organization, the way we think about talent? But two, how do we think about the way AI will have an impact across the entire product development lifecycle in the way that we think about going from idea to production in our organization?
So I wonder, you mentioned something, you mentioned about sort of this fuzziness, and this sort of question of ROI, where are you seeing your customers seeing the most ROI? Is it greenfield? Is it new code? But also, I want to bring in the mention where you just mentioned, like, sort of thinking about the structure of the organization. You just talked about, like, one portion, which is the development side, right? How it's getting fuzzy. People are needing to collaborate more. How do you see that, like, through the organization? Because that's what I'm seeing a lot of the same thing. Like, people are iterating together. This is allowing that. The what is a big deal. What would you say to organizations here and CIOs? How do you look beyond just the teams that are building the software now, thinking of the organization to help those bottlenecks not happen? And you've touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, what we see in the best adoption patterns, maybe to start with the first part on kind of how do we think about ROI, or how do we think about measuring impact of these type of things. What we see in the average organization is the very first thing that needs to happen is top-down buy-in. There are a lot of questions. I was at a talk with the CTO of a very large technology company. We're on the stage there, and doing a talk like this. And at the end, we did some Q&A, and went out in the crowd. And someone raised their hand. They said, "Hey, if I use AI, am I going to be promoted, or am I going to be let go of?"
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that was the question, the uncomfortable question. No one wanted to ask. But if you haven't had a statement to your company around your philosophy on what this era of AI is going to mean for them, I guarantee you questions like this are being asked. People read the news, people see what's going on. The first thing that needs to happen in organizations is a strong stance on how the organization views this as impacting the way that their organization is going to happen. And what we see in a lot of times when we work with organizations early on is the first thing you do is give people access to be able to experience this in a context outside of their day-to-day setting. People get very busy. You need to oftentimes give people a reason to actually dive into it. we oftentimes go and partner with companies to run hackathons or run, hey, a day away from work where you can actually work in real, projects to actually experience what it's like. Once you experience this new way of doing things, it's almost addicting in some regards. You get pulled into it and start experiencing it more and more. As organizations start to adopt it further, what we see is kind of an evolution of the metrics people want to look at. At the beginning, most people actually focus on quantity. How much code, how many lines of code are getting written into production by AI? I think a year and a half ago, this really was the North Star in many regards. I think it's a flawed metric in a lot of ways. I always tell my team, I can write 1 million lines of code. I just guarantee you don't want it in production. The right thing to track is the mix of quantity and quality. And I think this is the really big piece. How are we putting in the right guardrails to make sure the code that's getting generated is incredibly high quality code that it gets pulled into production without introducing any risk or security along the way. A lot of the way we've even thought about architecting our product is putting a lot of these pieces in place for customers, but we're oftentimes partnering very closely to say, how do you then move beyond just the writing code phase to the review code phase? So we actually introduced this product called BugBot about 7 or 8 months ago, and what it does is it runs a series of 4 or 5 different LLMs over a pull request or a bit of code when you're pushing it upstream to actually proactively find any bugs, QA issues, security things along the way. Actually now it proactively solves about 60% of the own issues that it solves or finds for our customers as well. So it's that evolution of getting people interested, making sure there's a clear piece, getting people in the tool and starting to track what does adoption look like, and then making sure we don't degrade quality of code as it actually comes along the way. Now what we see as that happens, which is interesting, is kind of a dispersion of these toolings across organizations. One example, we were working with a ride-sharing company, and it's funny, we thought they probably had about 5,500, maybe 6,000 engineers based on a lot of our conversations with them. And we're getting ready to go do an on-site with them, kind of getting ready for a hackathon. I was looking behind the scenes, it was like, oh, there are like almost 8,000 people using the product. Hey, maybe we need to go check the numbers. Like, or do we have the right number of engineers at the company? Did we write the notes down wrong? We went there. It turned out they'd rolled this out to all of their PMs. It turned out they'd actually rolled it out to half of their finance team. You start to see all these other organizations. And the way that I like to think about Cursor and many of these AI tools, but particularly us, is we do fundamentally want to be a focused company. I think a really big part of our edge is that we have been very explicit in saying we want to specifically focus on serving enterprises and specifically enterprise developers. Think about the hardest technical problems that organizations have. That said, what you see is that so many parts of an organization, not just software engineers, end up touching code. It might be data scientists working in SQL or Python, or it might be PMs working to prototype something and hand off a mock to a designer. Would we see anyone as this like core technical or technically light audience go in and start to do this? And as the technology gets better and better, I think it will even expand beyond this. We even see internally our whole go-to-market team, our sales team, actually creating an application to track all of the deal flow that they have and customer signals from external data sources. All of this spun up almost like ephemeral piece of technology. And I think we're in a world where essentially we should view it as the cost of creating software is increasingly going to zero. And it's a really exciting thing for the companies that think about all the surface area they have, all the embedded distribution, all the embedded data, all the edges that they have, to take advantage of this in ways that have just been far more complicated in the past.
Good. Can we go on for a whole day today?
Yeah, just keep going. We're not going to stop.
If you really look at software development, in the last 20 years, there have been more processes, more platform, and software developers have always said, let me just code, don't put all these boundaries around me. But there's something very interesting going on right now where the software developers who are using Cursor, they describe it really special. It's enjoyable, it's fun. They don't talk about how fast it is, that's just taken for granted. Why? What special you're doing, which now software developers start to say that this is fun, this is enjoyable.
Yeah. We have this saying internally, which is fast is fun.
Yes.
I think there are all these parts. the way I like to think about it, and when I even think about what we're trying to do as a company, we are trying to think about what it looks like to automate increasing parts of shipping software. I think when people hear the word automation, there's always baggage with that word. We actually view it perhaps a little bit differently, which is people overestimate how quickly we'll get to 100% automation, but probably also underestimate how quickly we'll get to something like 80 or 90%. And it turns out so much of the way developers spend their time is on oftentimes more of the rote toil, the repeated process of bumping packages and doing refactors, and areas where, frankly, I think they are repeatable processes with structured languages where we can get to increasing parts of automation. Now, the really exciting piece, and I think the average developer feels this when they use Cursor, is you go from spending your time, again, on more of that how category to that what category. You go from spending your time on the 80 or 90% of the work you need to do the real work to actually doing all the real work itself. And it's almost this fun feeling of you seeing, especially for engineers that have been doing this in their career for a while, the way you've done work in the past, you watch something that would have taken months, you get this immediate feedback cycle from it. That's very fun. We did this really interesting experiment, actually, about 2 months ago, where we used this long-running agent that we have to try and actually build a browser from scratch. Historically, we would have thought about that as a task that probably would have taken a team of something like 20 to 25 engineers, probably 3 or 4 quarters to actually get done, maybe a full year to do. And what we actually did was set up all the right architecture up front. Created a whole long PRD for it with explanations, went back and forth with the model. We actually set it off with this long-running agent harness, where essentially the way to think about it is we said, hey, go run and keep running. Why don't you just go at this until you feel like you have a first draft, basically. And it's really interesting. Over the course of 6 days, it wrote something like 1.3 million lines of code. And while there were a lot of bugs in it at the end, you could actually type in google.com, and it would render it in this browser from scratch, with all the underlying virtual machine that needed to be built, all the underlying architecture, all these different pieces. Just this kind of like crazy moment for everyone in the team where everyone that was a developer kind of sat back and said, holy crap, this is wild. It's totally changing the way I'm thinking about doing my job, and also it's exciting to think about all these ideas that we couldn't get to. And so what we actually see, maybe to take it more to the CIO, CTO level, the fundamental constraint has never been ideas. The fundamental constraint has been execution. Mm-hmm. Every year, leaders sit there and they say, here's the part that's above the line that we're going to be able to get to. Yes. And here's the part below the line. And actually, it's more like this that's below the line that I would love to get to, but I don't have time to. And the biggest advantage we see as companies really adopt tooling like Cursor is just taking stuff that's below the line and bringing it above the line to be able to take on much more than they had in the past.
Well, you have a front row seat. Hopefully one of these days I can just shadow you for a few weeks. You're seeing how the world's largest companies are adopting AI. Is there a pattern you can see and you can share with us, like how the most forward-looking companies and their executives are doing to adopt AI?
Yeah. I'll talk about maybe some of the most extreme pieces we see, and I'll talk about what I recommend. I do think, we talked about this a little earlier, the top-down piece is really important. I do think you have to marry the top-down push for this in the organization with the bottom-up love and allowing space for experimentation inside of organizations. If I think about some of the top, call it 5% of our customers, the folks who I think have done a really phenomenal job with adopting this on the frontier, we've even seen this taken to pretty extreme lengths. There's a pretty large multinational bank we work with where everybody at the VP level and above inside of their organization had 80% of their annual bonus tied to AI adoption of everyone in their org, for example. Something that's actually tying the financial incentives in really closely. We had another organization we worked with where if you weren't spending at least $200 a month on Cursor, you had to have a conversation with your manager. We've seen people really push this on the frontier. We were working with a customer last week where, coming out of their board meeting, they had their top engineer the prior month had spent $11,000 on Cursor. And at the beginning, there were questions around the concerns and the economics of it. They poked a level deeper. This was what they thought was one of the top 3 engineers in their entire organization. And what they did, instead of making a big fuss about that, they actually did an all hands for the company where they called him out and said, look at this amazing work that he's doing in our org, and actually walking through all of the things that he had been able to build himself along the organization. A lot of this is visibility and is showing to your teams how important it is for this adoption to happen in a great way in the organization. The other thing we've seen that really needs to happen is just a series of really great education and enablement sessions. We actually partner with companies really closely. We have this team we call the field engineering team. And what they do is actually go and work with enterprises at scale to think about a lot of these training and enablement sessions. In some regards, we hope our product is this experience where it's easy to get started using. But the depth of just how far you can use it, I think, does take more enablement. It's making it clear that it needs to be adopted, but then helping people understand that transition from powering up the work you're doing, like that phase 1 we were talking about, autocomplete, moving into phase 2 and thinking about pairing with agents, but also then rethinking this cloud experience where you can work with many agents at the same time. And what we find is just helping folks understand the way they can walk down that pathway and giving them tactical examples, giving them ways to experiment to try it out is really important as well inside of these organizations. So top-down, bottom-up love, pair that with the enablement. That's where we see a lot of organizations start to have this takeoff point of really going from there. And frankly, I've been very surprised where I've learned a ton working with these organizations. Every single time I go with a company to an onsite, they teach me something about how to use our product as well. But I think it is this canvas for organizations to start to go spider on and experiment with in ways that have amazed us. We saw everything from, I was with a smaller organization, about 75 people a few weeks ago. They did this crazy thing where they actually had they were on a customer demo call. They had the live transcript streaming into the voice mode inside of Cursor. And 15 minutes through the call, after they'd done a bunch of discovery, they clicked pause and the background said, help me build a prototype of this. By the end of the call, they demoed the customer the prototype they'd discussed in the first 15 minutes of the call. It's a creative idea that could never even think about doing something like that. You start to see explode inside of these organizations.
I mean, I want to just add on to that. I won't name one of the product managers from Mega 7 was watching a Warriors game with me, and he demoed it real time how he was pushing new features himself without any software developer. And this app is used by billions of people around the world. So I think what you're just explaining, how the world is going to look different, how software was developed and pushed, I think is beyond imagination now.
Yeah, and a few things we see on the team size, which is interesting. There's a really large customer we're working with in the hardware space of about 25, 30,000 engineers that use Cursor. One thing that they saw, which was really interesting, is after about a year of using the tool, they actually decided to structure their organization a little bit differently. What they found is you kind of saw 2 areas of increased productivity. One area was, obviously that the work you're doing, like writing the code, became an order of magnitude more productive. What they also found was that actually the steps between the software development lifecycle, the lines that connect those, were actually taking more times than not. There's a study out there that says for the average Fortune 500 engineer, they actually spend 1 hour and 53 minutes per day actually writing code. Crazy, you spend like less than 1/4 of your day actually writing code. So much of it is in meetings and doing the planning and the collaboration and the other parts. What they found was there's so much almost like organizational burden, whereas these people wrote more and more code, you could also eliminate some of the area of the coordination costs that came between it. So what they did is instead of just taking a team, they had a structure of these pods of about 8 engineers. Instead of just having the 8 engineers try and ship, let's say 2x the code because the tool made them 50% more productive, they actually split it out into 2 teams of 4. So actually both these teams of 4 are going to structure like teams of 8 in the past. And there's also this second accelerant in that because they're smaller teams, they can iterate and work with each other a lot more quickly without the cost of having much more people working on the project than they had in the past. And I think you're going to see a lot of these types of things start to change around when orgs think about how do you actually structure and build your organization in an AI native way. And this will be a challenge, for organizations that have had decades of experience with tens of thousands of engineers. It ultimately comes down to change management and thinking about how we're ready for what this is going to need to look like in the future. And this is where we're partnering also very closely with companies to help.
So you were talking about implementing, getting enterprises to bring it into their engineering teams. A year ago, we had somebody from another enterprise company on the stage on the enterprise side, and talking about what they were trying to do, and you mentioned some of this here, essentially forcing the engineers, and there was a lot of pushback a year ago. The engineers just didn't want to do it, right? And so it was, okay, now it's going to be incentive-based, whatever they can do. A year later, I'm sure you're seeing a lot of adoption right now. Like, the change just in a year is phenomenal. What are the engineers that are getting the most out of Cursor? What are they doing? Assuming adoption, both on the enterprise side and then, and obviously with your customers, but who's getting the most out of it?
Yeah, so generally what we see when we partner with organizations is kind of this bimodal adoption pattern. Oftentimes what we see is that the most tenured engineers are oftentimes pretty quick to adopt. Folks that are maybe the top 1% of engineers, these 10x engineers people talk about, oftentimes very quickly are trying out this tooling because they realize if you can 10x the 100x gain that they can have to do some of this stuff is very powerful. Also tend to see the more junior engineers inside of an organization adopt pretty quickly. Folks that have maybe just grown up with more fluency or use these tools early on in their career. It's oftentimes more of this like middle class in a way that's a little bit more difficult. Folks that have maybe been doing this for 10 or 15 years have a very certain tried way of doing it. And a lot of what we spend our time is thinking about how do we actually help take these folks down the adoption curve.
Just tell them that it's fun.
Fast is fun. That is one thing that we certainly say. Here are a few things that we've seen work well. I've already mentioned one of them, which is just giving people an experience outside of their day-to-day to be able to do this. But the other one is actually encouraging folks inside of your organization to kind of do almost like this reverse demo or peer situation. Oftentimes what we found was we could go and help companies by giving them enablement sessions and share this. But the most powerful thing you actually do is find a group of 15, 20, 25 people representative of all the different groups you have in your organization. Take these folks, really have them be these power users that then go throughout the organization and show real examples of them doing work in their org that are very contextual to people. Oftentimes what we found is when you see the task that you're spending your whole day on done in this new way, it's almost this light bulb moment where then you also have to go try it out and see what this is all about. So that's maybe been one of the biggest pieces that we've seen. To your other part of how do we actually think about the users that get the most out of Cursor, the folks that we've seen do this best have thought about this not just as an accelerant to the work they've already done. It's been the people that have thought about this as a rewiring of the process. We've talked a lot about this like collapse of the software development lifecycle concept. But it's these folks that have actually understood that the areas and the boundaries that we're going to run into are probably not just going to be in this same category, in this middle area of writing the code. It's going to be in these other areas that we're going to need to spider into and think about how we're appropriately building competencies in those areas to then go more full stack than we've been in the past. And you truly do see this. We see in some organizations, people will literally, in a small group of one engineer sometimes or two engineers, be able to go the entire software development lifecycle with less involvement of all the other stages in the past, which again leads to perhaps some of this re-architecture that we need to do of teams.
So, Jordan, a lot of good insights. I think we all will agree on this stage that the technology and market is changing on a weekly basis. One of the unique thing about Cursor is you guys allow software developer to select third-party foundation models, Anthropic, OpenAI, Gemini, even though you have some of your own models and so on. So does this mean then not everything is going to be just done by models? The workflow layer, which you have mastered, is also going to play a critical role.
Certainly, yeah. So the way that we think about our product is when you're using the agent inside of Cursor, you have access to all of the best models in the product. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, XAI, open source models, meta models, all the different things inside of the platform. And what we find when we work with a lot of organizations is, when you're working with Cursor, it's very helpful to be able to optimize both for performance and for cost the best models for the task at hand. We in fact have this technology that we call auto, which is when you are going to submit a query, we'll actually automatically route you to the best model for the task at hand. Sometimes you have a small change you want to make in your code base. Great, we can work very quickly and actually think about getting that back to you in a quick time and less cost. If you want to do a multi-file refactor or something that's very hardcore, think about a more intelligent, probably more costly model to be able to route that to as well. Organizations tend to love this both because it helps minimize the spend as this becomes an increasingly large line item for folks, but
So
also the intelligence. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a follow-up questions on that, right? So one of the stat is, at this point, close to 50,000 businesses are using Cursor. 93% software developers, when they are benchmarking Cursor versus other competing product, select you. And now you have reached $2 billion of annual revenue. When you look at inside, I want to know some secrets from you. How large is this market, right? From a revenue side, or how many developers? Can you just talk about it a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is probably one of the biggest markets we've seen in the history of technology overall, frankly. Because fundamentally what we're trying to do is think about how we can both take software that's written today and do that in an order of magnitude better than the past. But also, I think there'll be this explosion of software in areas where we didn't. I see this all the time working with different large organizations. I was with a very large bank the other day, and they're like, hey, we've had all this great distribution, but we've been more of a brick and mortar bank. How do we think about competing with a digital native fintech app? Something in the past they would have thought about as this multi-year endeavor, and they're now spinning up as this small project to be able to do it very quickly. We think ultimately what you'll see in this market is that it will expand over time, kind of working back from the overall R&D spend that you see in organizations. And one thing to think about this is people in the past, when they've thought about Cursor, have always thought of this as a spend per engineer. Hey, I'm spending $100 per engineer per month or $200 per engineer per month. What we're starting to see as we shift more into this world where there are these cloud agents, these longer running agents, is it's actually more tied to the project you're working on instead of just the individuals that are using it. More of a service level account concept. And I think actually the market this is moving back in towards is thinking about all of the R&D spend that organizations have, which oftentimes is the majority of an organization's spend for technology native organizations.
So, always as a venture capitalist, I'm always trained to start from the top and then you say really addressable and so on. So I won't use all the terms. How large is the addressable market for you, both from a dollar amount and number of developers, and where do you see that in 2 or 3 years, if you have to take a guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly if you just look at R&D spend right now, not only is R&D one of the fastest growing categories, it's estimated to be something like a $1.8 trillion market that we're working back on right now, estimated to grow closer to $3 trillion by 2030 with the pace of growth. So
that's good. And what's the number of developers?
Yeah, the developers question is interesting because I think the definition.
Yes, that's what I'm asking.
More than developer, yeah.
It's been historically estimated that there's something like 35 to 40 million professional engineers that are out there in the world. But what we actually view this as is that probably doesn't account for, one, the fact that many more people can be a developer than they could in the past by using Cursor for these different tools.
I'm not an engineer, and I have Cursor.
There you go. And these technically tangential audiences.
So am I wrong if I say in next 3 to 5 years, this number may get to 300 to 400 million people who are basically
I think it will
coding?
grow quite a bit. Yes, absolutely.
So, just to go back on a few things, if you think about, we hear this often, the term human in the loop, right? Mm-hmm. And we've got agents doing a lot of work. What do you when you're talking to enterprise? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so we're seeing this inversion a little bit. The first way to think about it is actually we had initially built our product as, you can almost think of it like a code editor that happened to have agents within it. The transition that we had to make in the last 3 months, and is an exciting one, to actually flip that around. It's now like the agent is the product, and you happen to have a dashboard for interacting with that and touching into the code and stuff like that, kind of all along the way. Same way in the past, I think we saw a world where humans were originating the agents and kind of tapping to them back and forth. We're also seeing that flip around. Oftentimes what we're seeing is now agents are going in longer running capacities, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, actually coming back to the human for feedback along the way. So in these long running agents, it's actually a whole notification system we've built where it might go run for a couple of hours, and 15 minutes in it might say, hey, I actually blocked on this one thing. Were you actually looking for the architecture to be this way or that way? And you'll actually give it a little bit more color and click enter, and it'll say, great, thank you. actually go run there. So we actually see some of our top engineers, it's crazy to kind of watch their setup on their screen if you just look over their shoulders. They will have this interface where they're working with 6 or 7 or 8 of these, and it almost looks like your iMessage, where it's like an unread text. You're going into that, seeing the progress that's made, answering some questions, going to the next one, and unblocking.
Does it pause before the instruction, or are they going to keep doing it?
And there's modes where you can make it kind of keep running, but oftentimes I think it will be a process of taking advantage of a lot of that taste, a lot of the architectural decisions, a lot of the organizational context that will continue to come from the engineers inside of an organization.
So I have some questions outside of Cursor and software development. On your personal life related to AI, what are the things you're really excited about what AI is doing for you to make your personal life better? And what are the wildest things you imagine will happen AI for personal use outside of work in coming years?
I mean, my favorite thing is a lot of my days are spent in meetings all day. The ability to turn AI meeting notes into like follow-up emails and next steps and action items might sound a little bit rote, but has actually been one of the biggest quality of life improvements that I've seen along the way. Some things that we've seen internally, a thing I actually underestimated was by building an AI tool and what we're seeing in our organization at Cursor, you don't just get to build in this interesting way where things are moving really quickly and changing a lot and you're morphing the way your technology looks. You also are like building your own company in a little bit different way than the past, where all the different parts of our organization are obviously very big Cursor users, but talked about an example on the go-to-market side where even a way we're doing a lot of our automated outbound campaigns is all done through a custom tool that we've built in Cursor. Our finance team actually makes our board decks in Cursor, which is great. I learned about this the other week when we were preparing, actually going in and it's already connected to our Databricks database and actually has that data in. So when you're asking it questions with also some of the image gen features we have is actually spinning up some of those early pieces of the slides inside of the product. I think what we're going to see is like for every function inside of an organization, you have to ask the question, if we just went to an offsite for a day on a whiteboard and thought about where are the areas where we could get really creative and experiment, how do we actually go make that happen? And a lot of that happens bottom up in the organization, partially by just being a really big thing that we focus on. We do this a little bit of a unique thing in our interview process, which is we do the classic things like, for example, for engineers, a coding test or coding skill set type things, behavioral interviews ahead of time. But the final piece of all of our interviews is actually giving people a real project and having them spend a day with us doing this. And what we're testing for there is obviously what are some of the raw skill sets when you get in front of a whiteboard without technology. But it's just as important to test someone's ability to be able to take advantage of this technology along the way. And we've put an above average amount of time into saying, hey, when you come into the organization, how are you going to use AI as a really big part of the work that you do here? Because we really pride that as something we think basically needs to be in place in order to remain competitive.
Good.
Well, I think we're pretty much out of time right now, but that was amazing. I could go on and on and on. Many questions. We are at an inflection point that's incredible. Like you talked about this idea, the idea of you have an idea and you can make something now. To me, that's the biggest unlock for everybody. Outside of engineering in any organization is that with something like Cursor, you said whiteboarding, and I know it's literally whiteboarding, but in a way now with something like Cursor, you can whiteboard with Cursor an idea and start to build something. If it's in your head, you can do it. And if you couldn't do it before, you can now. And I think that's the huge unlock.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful way to say it. Like one way to talk about what we're doing at Cursor is trying to reduce the time from intent to production.
Yeah.
And we'd love to be able to do that faster than ever before.
Jordan, thank you so much. I know how busy you are. Even though I asked you how you're using AI personally, you just talked 5 minutes just about the work. And I know how passionate you're enjoying. So really appreciate taking time from your very, very busy schedule to drive down there and be with us today.
Of course.
So
thanks so much for having me.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really happy. Yeah.